And let me just say that we are small enough that we can be on a first name basis. So hi, Alexander, David Eng, Jordan, David Azalina, Maria, pleasure.
Excellent. Well, I want to welcome everyone to this is actually our final event for GSWS and the Alice Paul Center this year. So in our final talk, this is our Collective Conversations Alumni Series, and our final speaker is our very own Jonathan Katz, who has been steering our ship and managing it to keep us all afloat during this difficult year as interim director. Jonathan, as I'm sure you know, is internationally known for his pioneering work at the intersection of art history and queer activism, history and curation. He's often referred to as a founding figure in queer art history, and he has established several queer and queer art studies programs and projects across the country. He has showcased works of many unsung artists throughout his career. He's also curated the largest queer art exhibition ever mounted. This year, he was awarded the Linda S. Hart Teaching Award, which recognizes faculty who have cultivated a learning environment that facilitates, encourages, and engages feminist critique, and who prioritize inclusive teaching practices. It's named for Penn Professor of English Linda S. Hart, who taught the first queer theory course here at Penn in 1995. So it's a very fitting that Jonathan is part of that important queer lineage here at Penn. He is fiercely dedicated to the success of our center and program, and as you'll see shortly, is also a wonderfully engaging presenter. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan to present The Queerness of American Art.
Thank you. So let me share my screen and we can dig in. Okay. So what I'm going to do today is just quickly go through some of the shifts in the history of representation of sexual difference, because of course, sexual difference is an historical factor. And the one thing we can say about history is that it changes. So we're going to see how painting can become a really, I think, uncredited archive of the very profound differences in sexuality over roughly 120 years. And one of the things that we're going to see is that, as in the Aikens that is up now, that painting that that antedates the development of the category homosexual in English. Of course, the word was coined in 1869 in Hungarian, translated into English in 1879, but not interestingly in wide use in 1885. So the very language we would use to describe a painting like this was unavailable to Aikens. Nonetheless, what Aikens does in Swimming is pose himself, and there he is at the bottom, staring at his naked students in a image of a waterhole, which he made moreover for as a present intended for one of the members of the board of trustees for his wife. And he actually received a rejection letter saying, you know, it's a lovely painting, don't get me wrong, but I don't think this is the best thing for my wife for her birthday. I hope you understand. What Aikens did is pose his students in the nude, photograph them, and then work on this painting in the studio. And as you can see, he's created a kind of circular movement that brings the viewer into the scenario, such that Aikens' own arm completes the circuit. And we're going to see that this is a move that's very familiar, most notably in Salietat, a painting that I would argue is one of the very earliest really forthright attempts to create a queer painting. In some sense, a queer painting of avant-la-lettre, right? A painting that does something remarkable, because here we have, and Aikens is a fabulous record keeper, so we have a lot of information about him. Here we have a model who's 23 years old. His name is Turkey Point Billy Smith. That's his fighting moniker. He's a bantamweight boxer. And this is the queerest kind of boxing picture you could possibly have, in part because, of course, nobody's boxing. The whole point of a boxing picture was masculine fisticuffs, blood, sweat, and tears. None of that is going on here. Instead, what we have is a scenario in which a bantamweight, ephebic fighter, I mean, he looks like a kid, right, is waving to the audience, and everybody is arrayed in that circle that's familiar from swimming, which you just saw, except now we are completing the circuit. And not only are we completing the circuit, but our gaze is drawn inexorably, structured by the painting's own formal qualities, to the buttocks of Turkey Point Billy Smith himself. And so we are staring at a fighter's butt when we want to see, a fight. And this is utterly in keeping with Akins's conception, I think, of sexual difference, which was manifested not according to the terms of our notion of homosexuality, but manifested more as a form of sexual dissidence. Akins was famous for that dissidence. Of course, it's what got him fired ultimately from the Pennsylvania Academy, but he was famous for doing things like removing the loincloth of a model in response to a question about male anatomy in a woman's drawing class. Classes in those days were sex segregated. And he felt it was unfair for men to be able to see women in the nude, but women not to be able to see men. So this was of a piece with Akins's consistent refusal of sexual norms. This is John Singer Sargent's portrait of Graham Robertson. Graham Robertson was a very interesting figure. And in 1938, he writes an autobiography. And he talks about posing in 1894, so many years earlier, for John Singer Sargent in this painting that's now at the Tate. And what's remarkable about it is that he uses a kind of queer coding that anybody with an ear to the particularities of queer speech of the period would have picked up. Because he narrates an incident in which he stands in this heavy winter overcoat on an August day in the studio, and it's extremely hot. He earlier remarked in a classic bit of sort of campy irony, why the great man would have been interested in me, a mere slip of a boy of 22, blonde hair with practically no musculature, I shall never know. And then he continues that, he's narrating that he's standing there in this heavy winter coat, and he said, all of a sudden I felt a little weak at the knees. The great man said, there's a green light just now. Oh my God, it's you. And as I started to faint, he grabs me by the lapel and carries me outside, leaning me up against the doorpost. And then he concludes this incident with the following. It's a shame Oscar Wilde opposite was not looking out his window. He would have realized that the wonders of Tite Street were not yet exhausted, end quote. So of course, what he's done here is turned the posing into a kind of queer incident in which Tite Street, which was of course the sort of the gayborhood of the moment, he would have seen John Singer Sargent grabbing a young man by the lapels, leaning him against the doorposts of the house. And Robertson tells us this, mind you, in 1938. Here is Sargent drawing his manservant, Nicola, in a position that we refer to, art historians refer to as an odalisque, a form specifically intended for female models to demonstrate erotic secondary sexual characteristics. It's intended to reveal breasts, to suggest but also hide genitalia, but it's consistently constructed as a female trope in art history. And here, of course, we have a man in it. This is F. Holland Day in a double exposure from his Orpheus series. Day is a remarkable fellow, a Boston Brahmin who ends up publishing, among other things, the Yellow Book by Oscar Wilde in the United States. And because he's insulated by class, he is not subject to the same rules as everybody else. The figure that you see in the double exposure is Khalil Gibran, the poet and writer and artist who stands in as a kind of Orientalist physiognomy in an image that importantly brings together two defining historical queer tropes, that of classicism, the idea of returning to a queer past, as well as Orientalism through his facial features as they would have been understood at the time. But it's this picture that I think most powerfully articulates the degree of change that we now can sort of sense in the early 20th century. This is a shower bath, and a shower bath was not, of course, a queer space at this moment. It was a function of the fact that most people still had only cold water flats. So once or twice a week, you'd go to a public bath and bathe. But inevitably, in so doing, you would encounter people who were same-sex inclined, who were cruising in such places. And George Bellows, who was importantly, right, a straight artist, and we have no evidence of any interest in same-sex sexuality, was nonetheless very much interested in the social margins. He was one of the founding members of what became known as the Ashcan School, because of course, it was understood that in his emphasis on the social margins, on people of color, on immigrants, on the poor, and on queers, he was, of course, looking in the Ashcan. And here Bellows is giving us not a painting, which would go into the collection of one person who would be potentially so inclined to appreciate its subject matter, but a print, and not just a print, but a print that proved so popular that it went through 3 different states. So this is an image that was one of his more popular prints. And the reason that's striking is that I think you can agree that front and center in this image, we have a homoerotic, right, dynamic. We have one figure who conforms entirely to then prevalent queer stereotypes. He's, of course, the figure thrusting his buttocks back, thin, effete, with that hand on the hip, the mustache, the leering grin, all the codes checked. The other figure is illegible as queer, and that's the point. He's the very paragon of sort of traditional masculinity. Even his face is an impassive mask, unlike the face of the queer. And what this picture does is tell us something about the dynamic of the time, because, of course, I think we can all agree that his towel is curiously starched. So clearly, he's interested in this arrangement. And what it tells us, in fact, is that within the canons of this moment, we know this both from this image as well as from a series of police and other documents of this period, a queer was somebody who had sex in which they occupied the gender of the opposite sex. So it was their gender that was overturned in the sex act. As a result, their partner was utterly normative because they were behaving in accordance to their gendered norm. And since gender was the marker of one's sexuality, gender normativity was the marker of one's sexuality, then of course he was being what men do, right? He was being the top, as men are supposed to be. In fact, we know that you could have had sex almost entirely with men, and as long as you assumed the top position, you were straight. If you, of course, did not have an emotional relationship, hence the impassive face. If you had an emotional relationship, then you were called a husband. But what we have here is evidence of this very, very different dynamic in which we have a queer and, right, this straight man who would have been referred to as trade in the period. And what it does, and this is the kicker, what it does is tell us that the modern apparatus of gay liberation that we assume cannot be unproblematically fought in this context. Because of course, one of the questions my students often ask is, well, why didn't in the early 20th century, the queer community develop the apparatus that queer liberation has today? Why did it wait so long? Why weren't there gay neighborhoods and gay publications and the gay marketing and the whole stuff of a queer world? And the answer is, of course, that in this moment, there would have been absolutely no reason for queers to segregate themselves. What were two men who were bottoms going to do together? You needed, as it were, the straight world, right? You needed trade in order to make you queer in the first place. And so as a consequence of this, queer and straight lived together, needed one another, and participated in a common culture that didn't produce this sort of segregated apparatus of gay liberation that we understand today. And we can see Bellows really interested in this problem because here is a public picture. This is a painting that is 8 feet long and 6 feet high. So very much intended for public display. And it's a picture that is very strange because it is an essay, let's not kid ourselves, in adolescent flesh. And what's striking about it, it's actually the East River area where immigrant and poor kids would find effectively a watering hole. And mothers would come and drop off their kids or pick them up. And we see all of that taking place in the picture. And everything is motivated. Everything belongs, with the exception, of course, of this figure, who is dressed as a dandy and is clearly there just to watch. An acknowledgement of the degree to which, right, queerness is utterly woven into the fabric of normative daily life. My point is that queer and straight at this historical junction were quite familiar with each other, much more familiar than we understand today. In fact, the very binary construct of queer and straight would not have made sense at this historical period. That is a modern development, which we'll come to trace. And on that street, we can see this very clearly because this is a watercolor by Demuth. This is Demuth. We always know it's Demuth because he had a bad leg and shows himself always with a limp. And he's on that street, which is a street that fronted the Brooklyn Naval Yard, where you could go, queers knew, to pick up sailors on shore leave. In the language of the time, seafood. What it offered, right, the sailors was the prospect of a hot meal, companionship, a little money, and a free place to stay. And since they were called upon to do what men do anyway, it didn't really matter with whom you were doing it. For the queers, of course, it was a wonderfully handy arrangement to meet hot young men. But on that street, we see the prospect that the easy dynamic is being derailed because here is Demuth looking askance at a young queer sailor, not trade, right, who is also trying to pick up the trade that Demuth is trying to pick up. So somebody is horning in on the action. And of course, it doesn't make sense because he doesn't have a place to offer. He doesn't have money. He doesn't have any of the things that the sailor is looking for, the trade sailor is looking for. And so the trade sailor is looking at Demuth. That same idea of erotic circuits and the complexities therein is realized in Distinguished Air, where again, we see a Demuth avatar. There's the cane, right? And the same brown suit, holding a woman, but checking out the ass of the sailor, right? Who is holding onto a man as a woman is looking at a Brancusi-like highly phallic sculpture while putting a fan over her genital region, right? So a very comic take on modernism. But it's this picture that I think most clearly articulates how there is a common culture at the time around questions of sexual difference. This is one of the images by Demuth that he called poster portraits. They were effectively using aspects of a figure, well-known public figure, to articulate them in a portrait. This one, excuse me, is for Bert Savoy. Bert Savoy was the leading female impersonator of the 1920s. And Bert Savoy was famous for concluding his act with a bang, removing, as always, the hairpiece, the great reveal, right? And then receiving armloads of calla lilies, presumably because the calla lily is an image of masculine and feminine united. And so here we have a poster portrait which has it rising out of a very sort of female-coded image of a shell. And similarly, in this poster portrait, which is dedicated to Gertrude Stein, which is dedicated to Gertrude Stein, where you have, of course, the repetition of love and the mask. This is one of the earliest photographs of a lesbian. And I say that advisedly, right? Because what we have here is Berenice Abbott trying to find an iconography to suggest lesbianism. Remember that, of course, within the latitudes of popular culture at that moment, and to some extent even today, women were free to touch one another in a way that wasn't articulated erotically. They could be friends, they could be family, but physical touch was not as freighted. And so the problematic becomes, how do you suggest lesbianism? And of course, what Berenice Abbott chooses here, quite remarkably, is Flanner is dressed mannishly as a new woman. It's not male clothes, it's not drag, but it's mannish. And of course, removes the masks onto the top hat, gives a direct gaze, which would have been unusual for the period, and therefore attempts to manifest Flanner's lesbianism quite directly. Flanner, a famous journalist, the author of the New Yorker's Paris letter at the time, was a well-known figure in the United States. Berenice Abbott would return after a 5-year period photographing expat queers in Paris, would return to become one of the great photographers of New York, and deny that she was ever involved in this, and would never articulate her lesbianism again. This is Romaine Brooks's self-portrait, a remarkably frank image, precisely because at this moment, Romaine Brooks was the third wealthiest woman in the United States. She had inherited vast sums from her family, $90 million. At that point, that's a huge sum of money. And so she never sold paintings. She didn't need to. She simply made pictures for her own enjoyment, gave them away to friends. And so this remarkable self-portrait. But I think it's this picture by Cecil Beaton that really, I think, aggressively looks to understand what effectively a lesbian iconography should be. Of course, it's Alice B. Toklas and Gertrude Stein, and of course it replicates the larger dynamic between these two, in which Stein always understood herself as the husband, that their image was an image effectively of a heterosexual marriage. Stein dressed in more masculinist attire, not drag, but more masculine attire. But what's most remarkable is, because women could touch one another without it being suggested, paradoxically, what he's done is separated these two figures and suggested their intimacy through their separation. And then, so as not to allow us to miss the point, drawn that electric wire to, as it were, electrify the space between them, drawing them together, and thus articulating, right, a notion of togetherness. This is an advertisement that appeared for Prove It On Me Blues by Ma Rainey in 1928. Prove It On Me Blues was one of the great queer blues songs of the period. And anybody who's dug into the history of the blues will come across a profound strain of queer blues. It was a big part of African-American culture at the time. And Ma Rainey in 1925 is in 1928 making a song about the 1925 incident. And the 1925 incident is this. She was conducting effectively a lesbian orgy in her apartment, and it started to get loud. And the neighbors complained, and the police came, and they busted down the door, and all the young women could escape, but Ma Rainey, who was a woman of a certain girth and somewhat older, fell down the fire escape, and she got arrested. And there was, of course, no legal code for running a lesbian orgy at the time, so she was charged as the madam of a house of ill repute. And Ma Rainey would have had, were she a white woman at the time, I think, this would have been, shall we say, a career limiting experience. But as an African American, she was able in 1928 to produce a record about it, Prove It On Me Blues, which has the following lyrics. They say I do it, ain't nobody caught me, y'all gotta prove it on me. And then she goes on to say, yes, it's true, I wear no collar and no tie, and I wear a collar and a tie. Yes, it's true, I don't like no men. Yes, it's true. She goes through a whole list of things that she even calls herself a diesel dyke in the context of this. But she says, you all got to prove it on me, because of course she was caught at the bottom of the stairs. And in the advertisement, what do we see? We see Ma Rainey right here, talking up two svelte younger women while cops are looking at her. So Madonna-like, right? She's using this incident to sell records, and remarkably, it worked. The #1 song of 1928 among so-called race records, songs by African Americans, Prove It On Me Blues. This is Grant Wood's Arnold Comes of Age. We don't think of Grant Woods, the painter of American Gothic, as a queer artist, but indeed, after training in Paris, he decided that he didn't like the expat homo life, and he returns to a kind of queer life in Iowa, where he was born. And as you can see in the watering hole behind him and the notion of Arnold coming of age, right, there's occasionally in these images a kind of quiet eroticism. But it's this painting that I particularly want to emphasize, because this is Marston Hartley's painting number 47, part of a series called the German Officer Portraits. Now, when I was in graduate school, these portraits were taught to me as the first instances of abstract art produced by an American. And the argument was that Marston Hartley in 1914, 1915 was in Germany, and Germany was close to Paris, where Picasso and company were innovating Cubism at exactly these years, 1914, 1915. And so this is part of the high modernist development. What we now know is that, in fact, Marston Hartley went to Germany to be queer. He fell in love with a German officer named Karl von Freiberg, who sadly was killed in the dawning days of the First World War. You can even tell what age he was at death, right? Because the entire image is larded with images about Karl von Freiberg, right? He's 24, he was a member of the cavalry, he was in the Eisenbahn in the 4th unit, he got an Iron Cross after he was wounded in battle and died. There's his German military helmet, and some private symbolism. That's Hartley's sort of image of reincarnation, and the entire image takes on the format of the Assumption of the Virgin into heaven, a classical trope of Catholic art where the Virgin is being pulled up into heaven. So it's, of course, an image of reincarnation, an imaginative rebirthing of a man that he loved. And of course, its abstraction wasn't about formal innovation. Rather, it was about the necessity of hiding the fact that he was in love with a man who was, moreover, an enemy combatant, because we were just entering into World War I. Now, I said that art history didn't know this, but what's remarkable about this image is that other queer artists knew this. Because in 1942, 3 months before Marston Hartley's death, the photographer George Platt Lynes photographs him. And he photographs him in this remarkable photograph that has Marston Hartley slumping in a chair, looking rather sad, with this kind of halo around his head, just like the halo that he gave Carl von Freiberg so many years earlier. And then this looming shadow, and that shadow connects to a man in the back in shadow, whose name is Jonathan Titchener. And Jonathan Titchener was the younger brother of a man named George Titchener, who was George Platt Lynes' studio assistant and was a man with whom George Platt Lynes was in love. George Titchener was killed in the Second World War. And so after George is killed, he invites Marston Hartley to the studio, dresses George in his brother's clothes, and through this looming shadow of death connects two generations across two world wars in forms of loss that couldn't be articulated in any other way. I find it one of the more moving images in the history of American art. But I want to do a quick detour into the work of George O'Keeffe. O'Keeffe is a very complicated figure, but I think helps to unpack what queer art history can do to the canon of American art. Because we know that George O'Keeffe slept both with men and with women. And of course, she became famous for images like Black Iris here, which clearly, are forms of erotic representation, not least because, of course, flowers are the sexual organs of plants. But what's striking about her work is that at the time, it was understood in such remarkably, breathtakingly sexist terms. There she is, finally, woman on paper, was one quote. Marston Hartley, no less than Marston Hartley, writes that she images herself yearning, waiting for completion, presumably completion being screwed by a guy, right? So not surprisingly, none of this appealed to Georgia O'Keeffe. And when she made images like this, a number of critics talked about them as the first representation of womanhood that, of course, acknowledged her availability, her openness. And thus these images became effectively recast as tributes to men. And that was especially because her husband, of course, one of the great photographers of the period, photographs her in the nude all the time. So people actually knew her nude body in some senses better than they knew the images that she herself made. As a consequence, she takes a photograph that her husband made by, this is, of course, Stieglitz's image of breasts. He took 312 images of her in the nude and showed them publicly while he was her dealer. And you can see her painted on the back of one of those photographs. That is actually on one of the photographs of her breasts. And you can see that very bold O'Keeffe down the middle, as if to reclaim her own body from its appropriation by her husband. And not surprisingly, right, she starts refusing to paint flowers and instead paints things like closed clamshell. So the organicism, the openness, the softness of the flower paintings start getting overturned. And then by 1930, right, she talks about how now she is turning exclusively to the desert. She will not do flowers anymore. And she actually writes an essay called About Myself, in which she articulates why. And she said, when I started to paint my flowers, you looked at my flowers and you hung all your associations of flowers onto my flowers as if I thought as you think, and I don't. That was underlined. And so I turned to the desert, and there in the desert, I found in the bones what I was looking for, something more alive than the animals with their eyes and their tails twitching, end quote. Now, if we look at this image of a cow skull, placed as it is, right, in this sort of concave, very labial, right, form, I want to suggest that what she actually is doing is representing a cow skull as effectively a female reproductive tract. Fallopian tubes, ovaries, right, the whole 9 yards, labia, but done in a way that is illegible to heteronormativity precisely because it isn't warm, soft, and inviting. It's the converse. It's dry, hard. It's vagina dentata, right? And when you see her work repeatedly, right, you will see these female forms realized through skulls. So like so many queer artists, right, she invokes a symbolic language, a coded language that allows her to pursue her interests in female embodiment, in this instance, right, as in so many others, under the very noses of dominant culture, but illegible according to its, according to her design. Here we even have, right, the so-called Indian paintbrush flower looking very red and labial just below the image. And indeed, even the landscape seems to be labial. And you see what I mean. So in the desert, she came to identify the images of female eroticism. And then, interestingly, around 1943, she starts to produce these very eccentric paintings of bones, pelvis with distance here. There's another one called pelvis with pedernal. And as you see, they broadly take on the form of the so-called Victory Sampras, right? The winged victory. One of the defining images of a sculptural image of female empowerment. And here, pelvis defined as a hole, right? But a hole with sharp edges that refutes the idea of the void, of the womb, of organicism in general. And I think the most compelling aspect of this is her goat's horn with red from 1945. The goat's horn, of course, is the locus classicus, pun intended, right, of kind of masculinist privilege. It's where we get the term horny. Of course, with the Christian logic, it turns into the devil, but originally it's the image of Pan. And what we have here is this hyperphallic goat's horn turned from extension into void. We're looking down the middle of it. Turning that masculinist into a female symbol. And if we don't get the point, of course, we have both the literal void where it's attached to the animal's head and the fact that it's painted in red. And tellingly, it's one of only 2 paintings that O'Keeffe turned into sculptures. Here she is at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art in the late 1980s, standing in a picture that she herself arranged. She told the photographer what she wanted, standing with her arm at the center of this phallic goat's horn, now made female. Paul Cadmus is what I believe begins to articulate one of the key changes I want to suggest. Because in 1947, we see the beginning of a whole series of homophobic legislations that begin to restrict the rights of queers. And what was formerly a kind of compact between queer and straight began to unravel. By 1952, that separation was complete, and there would be the beginning of a kind of modern witch hunt era in which the so-called Lavender Scare begins, the beginning of aggressive persecutions of queers. But the seeds of it are in 1947, 1948, when Eisenhower begins to root out queers in federal government. And what Cadmus does here is articulate a now binary form of sexuality. So on the left side of the picture is the queer side. And you can see here that that's Cadmus himself drawing the scene in a self-portrait. That's his lover, Jared French. They met in 1938. And then, in 1933. And then in 1938, he meets Margaret French, this woman, who marries Jared, and the three of them live in a somewhat tense but still workable tripartite relationship, and even work together as artists under the name Pajama for Paul, Jared, and Margaret. That's Lincoln Kirstein. He's actually the brother-in-law of Paul Cadmus. Kirstein married Fidelma, Cadmus's sister. But I think you can agree that everything in this scenario on the left is rather beautiful and peaceful. In fact, it has all the arts, architecture, painting, drawing, literature, and centrally it has this figure. That's Ian Forster. And he's the guy who in 1937 writes What I Believe, a short pamphlet that he wrote in part because he could hear the jackboots of the Nazis already. And the pamphlet asks the question, what will happen to Western civilization in the coming conflagration? How will it survive? And it answers it by saying a group of the sensitive, his word, will carry Western culture forth in the face of the destruction. And he keeps talking about the sensitive, and he says, you know, they're not an hereditary sensitive. In fact, they're self-selected. How do you know them? He answers, well, when one sensitive encounters another sensitive in the street, they'll hold eyes a little longer than is normal. And in Forster's way, he begins to articulate what we will understand as a kind of modern sense of queer identity. And in 1947, 10 years later, after the war, Cadmus resuscitates that image of the queers keeping the Western classical traditions alive on the left side of the picture. It's Elysian Fields. In the middle of the picture, there's a gigantic question mark in the sky above this phallic lighthouse. And on the right side, a heteronormative couple looking at the queer side. But after them, it's all death and destruction. Even the grass doesn't grow. On the top of the picture, Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini in a concentration camp raining down bombs on a group that is understood as, miscegenation writ large. You can be queer and not politically progressive. This is a really kind of caricatured image of a number of the races. It includes notably Jews as a separate race, and death and destruction. And so what Cadmus is doing here is quite literalizing the split of gay from straight, right? Giving it two sides of the painting. And we can see that as well in Lines' work. Here, we have an image of a man looking at us, the viewer, in a mirror, but that mirror is scarred. So his image of us is incomplete, and perforce our image of him is incomplete, as if we can't really see each other truly. Or this image, which is arguably the very first gay rights image in the history of American art. It's made out of a conglomeration of posing strap magazine figures here, all of whom posing strap magazines were called posing strap magazines because they were the most widely circulated form of softcore queer pornography It was, of course, illegal to show genitalia, but you knew that if you ordered, and you could always find the advertisement delineating this, if you ordered photographs of the models from the back of the magazine, they would be sent to you, and the posing straps were actually painted on in watercolor. And so you could lick your finger, wipe it away, and see what you wanted to see, and nobody got busted for sending illegal material through the US mails. This image of the mouse's tail has, among others, in it McCarthy. It has a self-portrait by Jess. Jess is a fascinating figure. He was actually one of the key physicists in the Lawrence Livermore laboratories in California. After the explosion of the atomic bomb, he decided he was no longer going to work as a physicist. He didn't like the direction his work was used. And so he abandoned his last name. He became just Jess and became an artist. And here we see him producing a posing figure out of posing strap figures, looking into a mirror made out of clowns' heads. And that mirror ends in a noose, and that noose ends in that sort of squiggle, which is an early instance of concrete poetry. It is, in fact, right, the mouse's tail from Alice in Wonderland. And the section that he quotes reads, "No need for a trial, no need for a jury. I'll be the judge, I'll try the case, and I'll sentence you to death." So this is a pretty angry image of what happens when queers seek reification in dominant culture, and really tells us that the world that was once so close is now torn asunder. This is Robert Rauschenberg's Should Love Come First, one of the early paintings by Rauschenberg that really thinks about his sexuality, because Rauschenberg married a woman named Susan Weil in 1952. In 1953, he goes down to Black Mountain College, and there he meets the artist Cy Twombly, and they become lovers. And as he's down there, Sue is taking care of their 1-month-old child. And so, as it says at the top, my problem, should love come first, love versus, right, a certain sense of responsibility. What Rauschenberg does in this image is think this through, and he thinks it through by thinking through all these forms of doubleness. Look carefully and you will see there's a 7 and a 7, there's a 1 and a 1, right? Everything mirrored. 8s, of course, as a number, they are the perfect emblem of same with same. Here as well. And then this footprint, which is a footprint, a kind of self-portrait, it's Rauschenberg's footprint, against an Arthur Murray dance studio male position dance diagram. And the game that, of course, you play and you create boxes to close it off, and whoever, I don't know if you do it if you win by closing them off first or last, I can't remember, but nonetheless, that game. And then this weird diagram, which is a diagram of railroad distances from Washington, D.C. So an analog of the idea of drift from a presumed norm. My point is that the entire picture is a kind of meditation on his queerness, and Rauschenberg would feel that it eventually was too legible because he did this to it. The picture was unsold, but a young man by the name of John Cage walked into the gallery one day and said, I like that, I'd like to have it, but I don't have any money. And the proprietor said, well, you're going to have to talk to the artist. So he calls up Rauschenberg, he gets the number, calls up Rauschenberg, and Rauschenberg said, sure, you can have it. And that begins their fast friendship, which lasted both men's lives. So close, in fact, were they, that Rauschenberg received a key to Cage's apartment and one day lets himself in and repaints the image to look like this, one of his so-called black paintings. I'm running out of time. I'm going to skip Erase de Kooning, but I do want to talk about this work, which is Mother of God. Here, Rauschenberg is producing a whole set of images that I would argue are intended as kind of camps or ironic appropriations of abstract expressionist tropes, an attempt to cool the temperature on the so-called hot art, the hot expressive art of abstract expressionism. So here, what we have is a collage consisting of a group of road atlas maps of Washington, D.C., collaged onto canvas. But in the context of their period, they would have looked like Jackson Pollock's drips and squiggles. And of course, where one would expect to see the concentrated form of gesture is simply a blank white space, manifesting that you are only seeing what you yourself put into it, or as Rauschenberg once put it, meaning belongs to the people. At the bottom is a quotation from, of all places, the Catholic Review. It says, and I quote, "A spiritual roadmap as simple and fundamental as life itself." And so, right, what he's doing is he's taking this whole idea that abstract expressionism is an index of life and undercutting it. And this was the literal show that preceded Rauschenberg's at the gallery. This is Rauschenberg's response. So this is called Wonderment. This is called The Man with Two Souls. And playing off of the submerged phallocentrism of the work in a highly ironic way. Of course, this is Rauschenberg's famous white paintings, that which gave Cage the idea subsequently for 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, which he, Cage, himself acknowledged. But interesting, Rauschenberg said that they could be painted by anybody using house paint and a roller. He said they'll eventually yellow. When they yellow, just repaint them. He was trying to get rid of the whole idea of the expressive, of the authorial. Manifestly, when you look at these, all you see is whatever you, right, as the viewer, are engaged in, whatever your cognition might be. And then, in 1952, Rauschenberg produces this painting on the left, Yoicks, which is totally different in every regard. Yoicks is, in fact, for example, a title. Everything up to this point, white painting, right, black painting, they were purely descriptive, sort of non-titles. He would have called them untitled had that been available. But this, Yoicks, is an ejaculation of a kind of emotion. And moreover, it trades in precisely the formal vocabulary that up to now has been rigorously excluded by Rauschenberg. Drip paint, squiggles, all those signs of gesture and emotional authenticity that he had rigorously foreclosed in his critique of abstract expressionism, because the white paintings were the size and the scale of abstract expressionist paintings, but so definitionally without content, right, that they became totems of anti-expressivity. And then here it is, fully expressive. And if you look carefully, you'll see that this image is divided into two, joined in the middle, and the lower half broadly can be understood as an image of the American flag, with those dense concentration of comic strips on the left side, and these images of red and yellow like the stripes of the American flag. And not incidentally, Johns is painting his famous American flag painting in the apartment above at the very moment that Yoicks is being painted, because they had become partners. And my point is that this is evidence that Rauschenberg now expresses when he has someone with whom, right, he can have an understanding. And Strikingly, if we read the comic strips in this image, we see all these references to Jasper Johns, including one snippet that reads, 6'1", hair sandy, eyes blue, my dear, you're not as guilty as you think. A portrait, physical and psychological, of Jasper Johns at the time. There's another snippet which reads, shall we stop in Hawaii for the honeymoon of Captain and Lieutenant Charles? Now, it reads, of the captain, comma, Lieutenant Charles, but you can read it as the honeymoon of the captain and Lieutenant Charles, and Rauschenberg is playing that game. But it's this work that I think most clearly articulates the degree to which Rauschenberg is playing with the idea of a bifurcated or divided community, where gay and straight are now segregated, as we saw in Cadmus's painting, What I Believe. On the left side of the picture is a picture called, combine called Untitled. He's starting to use the term, or Man with the White Shoes. On the right side is an image called, oh goodness, Odalisque. Odalisque is a fantastic neologism because it is, of course, a combination of two terms, obelisk and odalisque. And an obelisk is this highly phallic image. And of course, an odalisque, as we saw, is a classically female image. So male and female combined in the term. Why? Because this is the one on the right, is the very terms for thinking through heterosexuality. If you look carefully, it has, as here, right, images from girly magazines. It has a wolf calling. Remember, this is the moment of the wolf whistle. It has here, from the Boy Scout handbook, instructions on how to throw a correct and incorrect fist. It's actually labeled correct fist, incorrect fist. Here you have the scene of Venus cuckolding her husband. And of course, the whole thing is topped by a cock, a rooster. It was initially intended to pierce a wedding cake made out of cardboard that he purchased out of the window of the local Woolworths with a gigantic image of the bride and the groom. So he wanted it to pierce right down the middle, but he couldn't get it to stand. We know from his notebooks that it kept falling over. So eventually he hit on this idea of having the balustrade pierce a pillow, and he stiffened the pillow with plaster so that it could hold its own weight up. So that's the straight side of the image. On the queer side, we have an image of a man reflected as, right, the trope of Narcissus, the Freudian reading of homosexuality. And that man looks like Cy Twombly, his first lover. But moreover, there are actually letters from Cy Twombly in this side. There are pictures of Jasper Johns. That's a picture that Rauschenberg would later say was taken when he had first met Johns. And he says, Johns is extremely lovely here. It also includes a number of very valuable family artifacts, including a notice of his parents' wedding anniversary. I mean, wedding, not anniversary, their actual wedding. A painting, a photograph from 1928 of his mother playing with friends. The notice that his sister had won the Louisiana Yam Queen competition. It's like a scrapbook of both queer and straight family love. So it becomes a way to sort of talk about love. And on the upper side, right there, this is an American flag. You can't see it, you're just gonna have to trust me. Bringing Johns into the mix. And here, of course, instead of being topped by a cock, it's got a hen at the bottom. So what we see is that Rauschenberg is thematizing homo and hetero in two separate works that, by virtue of that shared balustrade, right? And you can see it's empty behind. By virtue of that shared balustrade, are constituted as pendants. And I'll just show you one more image. And there we see, right, that same hen. That's the image of his mother playing. Here is a 19th century photograph of two women kissing. This is a letter to Rauschenberg from Jasper Johns. On and on. All these images of family and erotic love conjoined. And of course, an image of his son, Christopher. By 1958, in this image, Kickback, the queer content in Rauschenberg's work becomes quite profound. Here we see Jasper Johns's pants. These are his literal chinos. And out of the chinos is a black scumble coming out of the crotch, and then a tie. And in case we miss the import of this, it says king at the top and what you want at the bottom, articulating a kind of erotic joke. Johns was famous for, shall we say, talents beyond his pictorial ones. And notably, we have an image of the very first icebreaker from a photo essay in Life magazine, breaking the ice, coming up into the air. You can do this one. This is photo from 1958, that same year. And if you look to your left, it simply reads your ass. It's obscured, but it reads it. By the time Rauschenberg and Johns begin to separate, Rauschenberg, as here, is thinking through questions of sexuality even more expressly. This is canto number 14 from a suite of images illustrating Dante's Inferno. And canto number 14 in the Inferno is the tale of one Ser Brunetto Latini, who was Dante's teacher. And Latini is placed at that level of hell with all the other sodomites. And the punishment is to run barefoot continuously over hell's hot sands. And so what does Rauschenberg do? He outlines his own foot in red. And in case we miss the implication, he has a bunch of small footsteps leading to a furled flag that is an American flag, obviously connecting this image of the sodomite to his now ex-partner, Jasper Johns. I'm going to conclude then with one short interpictorial dialogue between the two. This is a painting that was on display here in Philadelphia, and this is really why I'm doing this, in an exhibition a couple of years ago called Dancing Around the Bride. An exhibition that really did dance around the bride unintentionally because it was supposedly an exhibition about Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, John Cage, Merce Cunningham, and their combined relationship with each other and with Marcel Duchamp. But never once did it articulate the fact that John Cage and Merce Cunningham were partners, or Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, or Robert Rauschenberg and Cy Twombly. None of that was ever retailed on the walls of our own local museum. This image, the bride, was in it. It was, in fact, the central image. That's why it was called Dancing Around the Bride. And you can see that it has a fork in the middle of the canvas. Interestingly, this is Johns's response, an image of a spoon. It's called Spoon. And it seems to be related to Marcel Duchamp's very clever replacement of the knob on his apartment door with a spoon. But in the great breakup painting that Johns makes, referencing the great breakup poem In Memory of My Feelings by Frank O'Hara, Johns is here, of course, referencing that fork and spoon. It's on the left side, tied together in wire. In fact, the entire image is bifurcated. On the left side is the pre-breakup side. On the right side is the breakup side, is the post side. The image as a whole, of course, looks like an American flag in reverse, right? The very American flag that Johns was making at the time that they became partners. Now, right, blocked out. And the whole image has, as you can see, these hinges as if it can fold up on itself, a perfect pictorial metaphor of Johns's emotional realities. Why do I say that that's the pre-breakup side? Because the other side has the same fork and spoon, but they're segregated. There's the spoon, it's hard to read. There's the fork. They've been pulled apart. And actually here we know, because we've x-rayed it, that it reads dead man. And there's a skull and crossbones, all underneath that heavily scumbled paint. Now, in complicated ways, this is a painting that articulates Johns's reading of Frank O'Hara's poem, which I'm not going to get into, but suffice it to say that what's interesting about this is that it inaugurates a conversation about forks and spoons that continues throughout Johns's career. This is out the window, and you can see here that there's a fork held in tension, and below it an image of a spoon. There it is. And why that? Because if you look carefully at this drawing, you'll see that a fork acts as a counterweight that pulls down an eraser that wipes away a word, and that word is a voice. Because absent the relationship, Johns is genuinely worried that he's lost the ability to find someone who understands what he's trying to get at, who shares his voice. This is the painting voice. Now you can see that the fork and the spoon, it's hard to see, but it's there at the edge, right? That the fork and spoon have been separated, also acting as a counterweight to eliminate the voice written here. When Frank O'Hara died prematurely in a horrific dune buggy accident in Fire Island, John produces this image called In Memory of My Feelings. And even as late as 1982, in this image called Dancers on a Plane, if you look carefully, you'll see that there's now fork, knife, and spoon as the literal frame of the image. We'll skip that, skip this, and go here. I want to suggest then in closing that what Johns is looking to do in his images is to cause his objects to speak. Therefore, not surprisingly, the theme of a ventriloquist animates a lot of his thinking. And in this painting called The Ventriloquist, we see that precisely. This is an image at the top of Barnett Newman, an image called Voice. This is a flag, as these are two flags, two images by Johns. Why in brown, in orange, black, and green? Because they are the color wheel obverse of red, white, and blue. If you stared at this and you stared at a white sheet of paper, your eyes would reverse it and you would see red, white, and blue. So it's a perfect instance of the way Rauschenberg argues that meaning in a work of art is a product of a combination of the artist and the viewer's cognition. And we see that even more directly in Johns's use of a portrait vase here at the bottom, a portrait of Queen Victoria and Prince Philip, but also, of course, a vase. And as an optical illusion, it switches between the two. That's Johns's collection of George Orr pots. George Orr, the potter from, well, he was from Alabama, but Southern identified in the way that Johns was. But it's the thing I most want to attend to is the strange form on the left side of the image. I don't know if you can make it out, but I'll trace it with my cursor. Anybody recognize that? It's the image of Moby Dick from the frontispiece of Moby Dick, one of the great queer novels. And of course, Ventriloquist as a painting has Johns appropriating Moby Dick in the way that Melville, in writing Moby Dick, used the emblem of Moby Dick as the image of homosexuality, right? The great white whale that is constantly threatening to kill him, that is tied to him in a profound way, that he must kill or it will kill him. The novel opens, right, with, with Captain Ahab in bed with Queequeg, chapter 28, sperm, men grasping hands in an orgy of sperm. They're, of course, butchering the whale and taking out the spermaceti, but obviously Melville knew what he was doing. Johns, therefore, right, in this open-mouthed whale, throws his voice through the image of the whale Moby Dick, the way Melville threw his voice in the novel. All, of course, voicing sexual difference. And we see that even more profoundly in this drawing from the same series. Now the whale even more clearly delineated, but notably, if you look carefully at this image, you'll see that the reserve is that of a figure I, articulating Johns's presence in this image as well. And I want to conclude with this. A couple of years ago, I get a phone call from a dealer I know who had just been selling this famous work of Jasper Johns's called Drawing for Two Flags from 1969. He turned it over as part of a reframing job, and he noticed what you see at the bottom, Study for Two Fags. Of course, 69 is not irrelevant. That's the year of the Stonewall riots, and an acknowledgement of Johns's self-identification and the potential metaphor operative with these two flags in his work. Thank you. Happy to entertain any questions, comments, anything.
And feel free to unmute and just jump in. There's a lot of eye candy in the last hour here.
And you don't have to ask a question either.
Well, I have a very ill-formed comment / question.
Sure.
So you presented this as mostly a chronology.
Yeah.
And you sort of started by framing this way of reading these images in terms of how queerness was defined in relation to heterosexuality and gender roles, and that was the way you could sort of interpret and understand what's going on. And not that I'm trying to say it's linear, but it seems to move in somewhat of a trajectory to become that, you know, it's no longer a logic of defining sexual difference by, you know, in relation to heterosexuality, but in all these sort of other analogous ways. So I'm just wondering if there's, you know, maybe this is an oversimplification, but was that a little bit intentional, that just how you were painting the interpretations of these works?
Yeah, it was. I mean, what I'm looking to do broadly, I confess, is to show that queerness was the operative mode in the early 20th century. Then we have this moment of homosexuality, right, which is constituted as broadly binary to heterosexuality in the 1950s, right? As late as the 1950s, where we start to conceive of a binary system of sexuality. And then, right, I'm arguing we're now in a moment of returning to that essential queerness. And I think in the long term, we're going to understand that the notion of a binary sexuality is every bit a product of a whole series of federal prohibitions than it is anything that was self-selected.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Jonathan, I had a question.
Yeah. Hi, Hartley.
Sorry, my phone is going off. I'm interested. I mean, thank you for the, I don't know if I should turn off my camera. Turn on. Thank you for the presentation. It was, I had never seen these pieces before, so it was very informative. I'm wondering if, I'm trying to see if you can, I'm trying to read Rauschenberg and O'Keeffe or put them in conversation. I'm wondering if you can comment how you can put these two artists in intersection, specifically O'Keeffe's series developed in the desert or through the desert, or textures from of the desert, and Rauschenberg pieces that have this, like you mentioned, obelisk or phallic symbolic representations. I'm wondering if how you see them in relation to a critique that can be developing during their time, if there seems to be like a critique of reproductive reason, if they ever like intersected, because it seems to me that these two works are developing in some sense implicitly a critique of reproductiveness, both the male and female.
Yeah, I think there are two things that tie them together. Of course, the first is that both are using the idea of coding, right? They're saying two things at once. There's a kind of personal significance to the work, and then there's a public significance to the work, and awareness that audience can be, and often is, of course, variable. In the way that, of course, everybody realizes when you say something to someone you love in a private language versus your public language, right? But I also think that as you note, in both instances, there's this refusal of the logic of reproductive imperative. And in Rauschenberg, that's often written through a kind of overturning of the terms or the norms of normative understanding. Let me give you an example. Rauschenberg in 1955 announces that he's going to create a project in which he's going to photograph the United States. He builds a camera with a 1 square meter focal area, goes out in his front yard and takes 5 photographs. And then he says, you know what, this is too complicated a project. And he shelves it. And of course, what he's trying to suggest here is that we use the term photographing the United States one way, but there's another way that, of course, it also means, and he's suggesting that we keep engaging in a social construction of the United States that isn't the literal thing, right? And Johns does that, of course, with his use of flags and targets and maps and all these images that are effectively social abstractions. They aren't meaningful in and of themselves. They're not things except as given identity through human beings. So in all senses, what I see them engaged in is a kind of decentering of the normative terms of language and looking at the constructed nature of meaning. I really, and I teach a course on this, I see them as the first postmodernists.
Thank you.
Anything else?
We have a comment in the chat is asking if this is part of broader work. Obviously, you've curated a lot of these pieces and written about them. What's the next thing that's coming down the pike?
So this is going to be developed in a book that I'm now working on called Hiding in Plain Sight, which looks at not just these figures, but basically the key figures in American art, from Akins to includes Agnes Martin, George O'Keeffe, but also contemporary artists like Felix Gonzalez Torres. And it looks at the degree to which so many of the key images that are constituted as canonical in the history of American art are in fact queer images, and we have never attended to their queerness. Anything else?
Do you mind if I ask you another question?
Not at all.
You know what? I really loved how you started with the portrait of Graham Robertson, right? This post, right? So I was thinking about the first time Jose Marti, a Latin American theorist or thinker of the 19th century, saw Oscar Wilde in New York, right? He described Oscar Wilde as this, he described his pose as this excessive and exuberant posing, or the way he was, you know, the way he was dressed and he was standing, etc. I'm wondering if this was like a deliberate way of you organizing your talk, like starting with this pose, right, that is excessive or exuberant to the eye. Specifically in the 19th century, we didn't have these terms that we have now, right? And I'm wondering how you're thinking or theorizing or curating or putting together these pieces, right, through posing, then through terms, and then through a more contemporary concepts of non-normative sexualities.
Right. And I think one of the things that I was trying to get at in the early part is the degree to which there is a refusal of any kind of binary construct of gay and straight. I mean, Graham Robertson writes his autobiography in 1938 in which he talks about this using language that is entirely legible to anybody who cares to attend to it, about the wonders of Tite Street and Oscar Wilde opposite and all of that. And we see in evidence in these early works, again and again, a kind of literal connection between queer and straight that makes the point that the binary idea of sexuality simply isn't operative. And then what I wanted to suggest is how it came. I mean, we see in Jess's image such a clear bifurcation, right? The figure of the queer in front of the mirror. And then finally, it starting to erode in our time. What I'm trying to effectively argue is that we haven't attended to art as this remarkable archive of the historical differences in the construction of sexuality. And what distinguishes art is its sensitive ability to capture nuances of understanding that language, by virtue of its deployment of words, can't touch. Language means you have to name something, but there's so much that's unnameable in sexuality that art can capture, and that's what I want to attend to. Anything else?
All right, well, please join me in thanking Jonathan for concluding our events this semester. A wonderful conclusion. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks all.